We will now admit our participants. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We will be getting started in just a minute. We have a few more people entering from our waiting room, and we'll get back in just a moment. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to the 2021 Technical Redistricting Academy presented by the Orange County Registrar of Voters. I'll be the moderator today. My name is Rebecca Lee and I'm the Training and Special Projects Manager for the Registrar of Voters in Orange County. This session will be the first of two planned sessions addressing the fundamentals of local redistricting and the role of the Registrars of Voters in redistricting. Session 2 will take place next week and will focus on the available resources and best practices to follow when redistricting. Before I turn this over to our Registrar of Voters, Neil Kelly, and our distinguished panelists, I want to go over a few housekeeping notes. So first, you may have noticed you are all muted for this session, and you'll be asked to raise your hand if you would like to provide comment, but we do prefer that you use the chat service. So in the chat box below, you will be able to notice on Zoom, you can provide comments and send your comment directly to the host. We will be collecting and monitoring all of the questions that are submitted, and then I will collect those responses and turn it over to our panelists to answer at the following their presentation. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and it will be available on our website at ocvote.com/academy following the meeting and also on our YouTube channel. If you encounter any issues, please know that we do have tech support available. The phone number is available on the screen, and we'll also add it to the chat so that you have it to reference. If you have any basic needs for troubleshooting, please contact the number on the screen or you found in the chat, and we'll be able to get in touch with you to help you make sure that you are able to hear us and you're able to participate in this meeting.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Neil Kelly, and I'm the Registrar of Voters for Orange County. I would like to extend my welcome and thanks to you for joining our very unique Technical Redistricting Academy. We've got a great turnout with hundreds of attendees expected at both sessions, which is great. During today's series, you will receive an overview of local redistricting and the ins and outs of mapping and ballot typing. And during next week's session, taking place on July 28th, you will learn about available data and resources and the very important elements necessary to ensure proper redistricting file preparation when you're dealing with our office. Before we begin, let me offer a brief word about why we are conducting these educational sessions. The Census Bureau, as many of you know, missed the statutory deadline for the delivery of apportionment data, which was released this year on April 26th, because of the delays caused by the pandemic and the anomalies found in the census data. The Census Bureau plans to release the legacy redistricting data without tables in mid to late August, and the more user-friendly data with tables by September 30th. This is a full 6 months after the original statutory deadlines. These delays have real impacts on states and local jurisdictions as it compresses the timelines for redistricting. As an example, under a 2020 court ruling extending timelines here in California, the Citizens Redistricting Commission, which is responsible for the state legislative boundaries, was ordered to have data delivered to the Secretary of State no later than December 15th. Even so, the Redistricting Commission recently petitioned the California Supreme Court to extend those deadlines yet again to January 14th, 2022. We typically in my office would have 4 months prior to candidate filing to complete the complex task of assigning voters to the proper set of districts according to their residence, not just a few weeks. Not only must we deal with statewide changes, but our Board of Supervisors, municipalities, school districts, and special districts will also be submitting updated maps to our office that need to be updated in our election management system and in place for the 2022 election cycle. These delays could have unavoidable impacts on candidate filing. It's obvious that there are considerable challenges, but we have been planning, forecasting, and running scenarios to adequately prepare for the past few months. It's my job to ensure that we clear these hurdles and to properly direct resources to guarantee a successful outcome. And that's where our Technical Redistricting Academy comes in today. We designed it as a technical review of our role in the redistricting process, and it is focused on file preparation, election data, and JS challenges. But more importantly, we conceived it to facilitate the timely submittal of boundary changes as soon as possible after adoption of new lines. This would allow us to make necessary updates and complete verifications so that all voters are properly districted before we're producing ballots. Conversely, this education series does not support the actual boundary changes for any specific jurisdiction, nor does it serve as a forum for the solicitation of input regarding any jurisdiction's redistricting process. Again, I'm very grateful that you have joined us, and I will now turn it back over to Rebecca Lee, our facilitator. Thank you again.
Thank you, Neil. Again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our session. I will now be turning it over to our first panelist, Nicole Walsh and Mark Servino from the Office of County Counsel.
Thank you, Rebecca.
And let me just make sure that my screen is cool. So, Rebecca, can you see the first slide?
Yes, I can confirm that your slides are up and running.
Excellent. Okay. Hi. So welcome to Local Government Redistricting. My name is Mark Servino. I'm here with Nicole Walsh, who is our the Senior Assistant County Counsel, and she is the lead counsel for the County of Orange redistricting effort. I am the assigned deputy for the Registrar of Voters. So Neil Kelly is my client, and I'm also supporting Nicole as part of the county redistricting effort. The focus of this presentation is to provide a very high-level overview of the process for local government redistricting. As Neil mentioned, the presentation is not tied to any specific agency's redistricting effort, since it is conducted by the Registrar of Voters. And of course, if you'd like more information about a specific agency's redistricting effort, I'd recommend consulting that agency's website. Again, it's a high-level overview, so many of the topics discussed you could spend a full hour on various elements. So this is designed to provide kind of a 10,000 foot overview. So the 2021 redistricting effort is going to present many challenges, and this is kind of an overview of our presentation. Even for folks who have been involved in prior redistricting efforts, I was involved in the county's 2011 redistricting cycle, but this is going to be very different. Number one, you have more local agencies conducting redistricting. A lot of it is due to changes or in response to lawsuits or to avoid liability under the California Voting Rights Act. As you mentioned, census delay. The census data is delayed due to COVID, and that in turn delays the start of redistricting. So you have the pressure that's kind of limiting your start date on the front end, but on the back end, redistricting must be completed several months before the 2022 elections. So for the county, which holds primary elections. We have the June 2022 primaries, and there's already been some efforts to address that, because originally the primaries were set for March 2022, and due to the pandemic, they have been once again rescheduled for June 2022. But of course, you can only go so far. And then finally, AB 849 makes substantial changes to the procedures and criteria that govern redistricting. But before one threshold question before you jump into districting is to go and ask, does your agency or the agency that you're interested hold at-large or district-based elections? Now, the at-large method of elections is kind of almost a catch-all. Like, if you're not having a district-based election, you might be having an at-large method of election for selecting members of your governing body. The most common and easiest to understand method of at-large elections is where voters of the entire jurisdiction, whether it be city or school district, elect members to the governing body. And the way you would see this in a ballot is when you select three, let's say a school board, and it says select 2 members or 3 members, and the 2 or 3 candidates who have the highest number of votes are selected. They can live anywhere in the jurisdiction, and voters from the entire jurisdiction can vote for them. So that's your classic at-large. There's also candidates may live in a district, so you might still have districts, but then voters from the entire jurisdictional area can still nonetheless vote for the representative for the particular district. So it's sort of a hybrid, but it's still considered for purposes of the California Voting Rights Act to be an at-large based election. And finally, you might sometimes have a hybrid where some seats may be at-large and some seats may be district-based. And then finally, what we're concerned with for purposes of redistricting is district-based elections. And that's a method of election where both the candidate as well as the voters who vote for that candidate have to live in that district, which is a divisible part of the jurisdiction. As previously mentioned, many agencies have switched to district-based elections, and a lot of this is due to the California Voting Rights Act of 2001, the CVRA. It expanded on the Federal Voting Rights of Act 1965, making it easier for minority groups in California to prove that their votes have been diluted in at-large elections. The CVRA applies to both general law and charter cities, school districts, and community college districts. There was some debate as to whether it applied to charter cities. That was litigated, and the courts have consistently held that it also applies to charter cities. And the CVRA prohibits the use of at-large election systems if it results in racially polarized voting. Now, many local agencies have switched from at-large voting systems to district-based elections to comply with the CRA, and it's pretty breathtaking. I mean, you have first year. So for the 2021 redistricting cycle, unlike 2011, just 10 years ago, you're going to have many agencies redistricting in 2021 for the first time. Statewide, you have 151 cities that have shifted to district-based elections over the past 6 years. And in Orange County alone, you have 17 cities that will be holding district-based elections versus 17 cities that hold at-large elections for city council seats. I understand, and again, hot off the presses, last week, I think Mission Viejo made the vote to switch from what is called cumulative voting to a district-based election. Since the enactment of the CVRA, hundreds of school districts and community college districts have adopted by trustee area elections. And one thing to keep note of, just again on the CVRA, I don't want to get too much into the CVRA because again, you could spend a whole hour on it. There's a case in the Supreme Court that is pending and which will probably be decided this year, which involves a challenge to an at-large voting system. And in that case, it involves, I think, the city of Santa Monica, and the Court of Appeal held that there was insufficient evidence that the city's at-large method for electing city council members impaired Latinos' ability to elect candidates of their choice due to the fact that Latinos only held 14% of the citywide voting power. And even if you were to go and, do redistricting, the most kind of concentrated district you'd have would be a proposed district that has a 30% voting block for Latinos. And the question was that sufficient to establish a claim that the city's at-large system violated the CVRA? So again, that stay tuned. And with that, I'll hand it to Nicole.
Thank you, Mark. So Mark has briefly gone over whether or not redistricting is even something that will happen in your jurisdiction based on whether or not you have district-based elections. But what is redistricting? Redistricting is the regular process of adjusting the lines of voting districts in accordance with population shifts. And those population shifts are based on, as probably most of us know, changes that are reflected in the census numbers. So every 10 years, we have the census and we see where those population shifts have occurred. I think it's interesting, probably within the last year, we've had a lot of unexpected population shifts, maybe not just within Orange County, but among states. In terms of redistricting, different levels of government have different responsibilities. So the state is responsible, as Neil mentioned, for redrawing congressional and state legislative districts through a redistricting commission, and that is mentioned on here. The county redraws the supervisorial district lines, and then city, community college, and school districts are responsible for redrawing those lines if they are a district-based election. In the County of Orange, for example, the County Board of Supervisors is sitting as the approval authority for the maps for redistricting. The elections code has actually required for a number of local counties, including Los Angeles, San Diego, and Riverside, that those counties have independent redistricting commissions. However, that is not true in Orange County. It is an option, but it is not required. And so the board will consider the maps, and the public in the County of Orange has the ability to create them. Next slide. Thanks, Mark. As Neil and Mark both mentioned, this year we have experienced a significant delay in the census data due to COVID-19. First, there was an extension that was directed at the collection of data. Normally, the collection of data is completed by April. This year, it was extended through October 2020, which is 4 months later than in prior redistricting efforts. In addition, the Census Bureau does not plan to release the data until at least by September 30th, 2021. This is 5 months later than it normally comes to us. The census has announced that it will release what is called legacy data by, we hope, August 16th, 2021, but that data requires additional processing. In addition, since the 2011 redistricting efforts, the state of California has determined that it needs to adjust the data that we receive from the federal government to reflect where incarcerated individuals had their last known address. So the state will process that legacy format data, and they have said we need 30 days. So really, we won't even have legacy format data that is completely processed until the end of September. And this is true for everyone. So it's not just the county, it's for the cities and the school districts and everyone who needs the data. Next slide, please. This has obviously created some challenges, but we already had challenges because there are also new processes and procedures in place for the 2021 redistricting. While throughout the redistricting efforts over the years, adoption of the maps requires a balancing between federal and state laws. In addition, this year, there are substantive and procedural changes that weren't in effect in 2011 or 2001. In fact, in 2011, the process was largely unchanged from 2001. However, this year, we have AB 849, among other bills, that changed the requirements and the process for redistricting. In addition, as we've mentioned, there was no pandemic in 2011 or 2001, and we received our data on time. In fact, the developments in the law continue. It's almost a daily update because the legislature is consistently considering how to adjust for COVID. And as Neil mentioned, there is a state Supreme Court case regarding whether or not the State Redistricting Commission can continue its efforts through, or conclude its efforts in January versus December. And so it's just a very fluid process this year. Next slide. For the county, we cannot adopt any maps earlier than 21 days after the release of the census data. So our approximate right is about the end of September. If the Census Bureau does what it says and the state does what it has said it will do and process that data. And so, and then on the back end, we need 174 days before the next election, which is June 2022. We have to adopt the map by that deadline. So working backwards, the deadline for redistricting, which is our election date minus 174 days, is December 15th, 2021. In 2011, the deadline was November 1st. So everything has moved in addition, because as a result of the Census Bureau's delays. The deadline to submit maps then to the Registrar of Voters is February 2nd, 2022. And as Neil said, that's a challenge because we are just getting, hopefully, if everything stays on time, we will just have the maps completed December 15th. The county's schedule is actually like the day before is our last public hearing. So we will be, and many jurisdictions will be in the same place because we also have to have a certain number of meetings and we have to do those in a certain number of time. So to go further into that for charter and general law cities, the timeline, I'll turn it back over to Mark.
Thank you. And the procedures that apply to cities are similar to the county. Again, no earlier than 21 days after the release of the census data for the statewide database. Now, the good news is that all the cities for Orange County cities, and I don't know about other cities, and when is that all Orange County cities hold their elections for their city council in November. So because it's in November, the good news is that they have more time. They will have until April 17, 2022 to complete their redistricting because the next election is on November 8th. Their deadline to submit their maps to the ROV is July 6, 2022. Now the bad news. The bad news, as we discussed before, is that we now have so many cities and school districts and special districts that are now redistricting, and many of them will be redistricting for the first time. So on the one hand, you have more time, but if a lot of these jurisdictions are adopting their maps close to the deadline, then you're going to have a crunch. And a lot of these demographers, redistricting attorneys, redistricting software consultants are used commonly throughout the state. So they can only be in one place at one time. So for those agencies that are listening in, you want to lock down your consultants and you want to go and pace out the process for adopting your redistricting maps and taking advantage of the fact that you have more time so that it's not all taking place at the same time. A quick explanation on the deadline to submit the maps to the ROV. The 125-day requirement is found in Election Code 12262, and the purpose of that is to give election officials an opportunity to implement the new districts and boundary changes before the normal 88-day filing deadline for nomination papers. And so that gives about 37 days from the deadline to adopt the boundaries to the candidate filing deadlines, which is still a very narrow window, but at least now you have a window. So for redistricting schools, for time frame for redistricting school and community college districts, the boundaries of trustee areas have to be adjusted before the first day of March of the year following the year in which the results of the decennial census are released. So here the redistricting deadline, and this is still pretty tight, is February 28, 2022. So there's going to be a little bit of a crunch there for school districts. Again, the deadline to submit maps to the ROV based on the November 8th, 2022 deadline is July 6, 2022. One tidbit for school districts that are online. There is a bill, SB 442, which was just passed by the legislature last week. I don't know whether it was signed, which allows school districts to more easily make the decision to adopt districts. I think before, even if the school district board makes that decision, then you'd have to subsequently run that. Yeah, you'd have to subsequently get voter approval for that, and that would sometimes create some conflicts with the California Voting Rights Act. So special district redistricting. There's not really a significant change from 2011. District boundaries must be adjusted by May 7, 2022, which is 180 days before the November 8, 2022 election date. Again, equal population, it has to be equal as far as practical. You have to comply with the Voting Rights Act. And in terms of the criteria, again, this is the way it used to be, and this applied. This was similar to what the county of Orange used to do back in 2011. Is that the standards are these discretionary standards. There's no particular order: topography, geography, cohesiveness, contiguity, integrity, and compactness, communities of interest. And that's it. I mean, there was no real explanation, doesn't give you the order, doesn't even say you have to go and apply any of these criteria. So, and then finally, there's only one hearing is required. In terms of public hearing requirements, just before, a governing board just needed to conduct one public hearing on the proposals to change boundaries before the public hearing at which the board would vote on the proposal. That was the old one. Now, the new law is that you need at least 4 public hearings, and one hearing had to be prior to the issuance of the first draft map. For the county, we've already started holding our public hearings since before the first map. You don't necessarily need the data. However, 2 hearings have to be after the draft maps are issued, and as a result, that means those 2, you can't satisfy that requirement until we get the data. Finally, one of the hearings has to be during a workshop or weekend, or on a weekend or weeknight after 6 p.m. Hearings must be accessible to people with disabilities. And finally, the date, time, and location for any public hearing or workshop have to be published at least 5 days before the hearing or workshop, 3 days if the deadline to adopt boundaries is less than 28 days. One thing to note is that there is notice of the public hearing for the purposes of redistricting. I think there's a recognition of technology. So publishing a calendar of all public hearings and workshop dates on your redistricting web page satisfies this notice requirement. So it's not your typical notice requirement where you have to publish it in a newspaper that oftentimes people don't read, or post it in the place in your place of business that we don't have a lot of traffic now due to COVID. So that I think is it's more effective for everyone. And then just one comment on the public hearing requirements. Back in the day, even though we were only required to hold 2 public hearings before the county would have an advisory committee that would meet in each of the supervisorial districts. The county of Orange will be doing that again, but this time these will be actual workshops to get feedback on communities of interest. Map publication requirements. This applies to both counties and the cities. Draft maps have to be posted online for 7 days before adoption of the final map, 3 days if you're within 28 days of the redistricting deadline. If available, the draft maps have to include total population, citizen voting age population, the racial and ethnic characteristics of CVAP, and that's the acronym, in each proposed district, And then finally, the census data from the statewide database must be available for at least 3 weeks before the release of any draft map. So even after you get the census data and it's published, we can't release the draft map normally until there's 3 weeks. And I think that also gives the public an opportunity to themselves provide input in the form of drafting their own maps. Of course, if it's 60 or 90 days until the deadline, this is reduced to 1 week. If fewer than 60 days, then there's not even a waiting period. AB 849 adds public engagement requirements. You have to make a good faith effort to reach underrepresented and non-English speaking communities. And we can do this by providing info to media, good government, and community organizations, including those serving language minorities. One of the requirements is that live translation has to is required if it is requested 72 hours in advance, or 48 hours if the hearing is scheduled less than 5 days before notice. So if you're interested in attending and you need language assistance in an applicable language, and for Orange County, that's Spanish, Chinese, Korean, or Vietnamese. Make that request at least 72 hours before one of the hearings. For cities, there's a little bit, the different definition of what is a applicable language is a little bit changed. It is, an applicable language includes a language that is spoken by city residents with limited proficiency who constitute 3% of the city's total population. Need a dedicated internet web page with standard redistricting info in English and any languages in which the county or city is required to produce ballots. So again, the applicable language requirement. The Secretary of State has translated templates available on its website. And then finally, public comments and draft maps may be submitted in writing or electronically, and those must be made publicly available. Finally, and then again, this is probably more for agency and city and school district members who are attending this. In terms of ordinance and resolution requirements, AB 849 still allows for district boundaries to be adopted by ordinance or resolution. However, if you previously adopted your boundaries by an ordinance, you probably will need a new ordinance, so please consult with your agency counsel. District boundaries are commonly described by meets and bounds or a legal description, or through a list of census tracts or blocks found in each district. The Register of Voters can process both formats. And finally, again, as mentioned before, the ordinance or resolution, after adopting your district map, you must submit it to the registrar no more than 125 days before the election. And in terms of map requirements, I'm handing it back to Nicole.
Thank you, Mark. So in terms of map requirements, primarily what we're going to talk about here are laws that impact the approval of maps that are approved and whether or not they would survive and how they could survive a legal challenge. Next slide. So in approving the maps, there are certain legal requirements that must be met. And the first is that districts that are created must be substantially equal in population. This is not true for congressional districts, but it is true for county, city, special district, and other redistricting efforts. That means the substantially equal has generally meant that a total deviation of less than 10% between the largest and the smallest district is presumptively constitutional. Under Elections Code Section 21500A1, population equality is based on the total population of residents of the county as determined by the most recent decennial census. As we discussed, these population in those districts changes over time due to population shifts. So we have to redraw the maps in order to get the districts into substantially equal population. As we discussed, AB 849 also requires the population to be adjusted to count incarcerated people at their last known home address. not where they may or may not be physically present while incarcerated. Again, population refers to people and not citizens. And this requirement is based on, for the substantially equal in population, is based on the Equal Protection Clause and the principle of one person, one vote. So that's one person's vote ought to be roughly equivalent to another person's vote within the same state. Next slide. So one of the additional legal requirements, aside from this substantially equal in population for each district, is that the map approved must comply with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the Voting Rights Act prohibits voting practices that result in a denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color. A violation of the Voting Rights Act is established if, based on the totality of the circumstances, the challenged electoral process is not equally open to participation by members of a certain racial minority group, in that its members have less opportunity than other members of the electorate to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of their choice. The Voting Rights Act was designed to enforce the voting rights that are guaranteed under the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution. And Section 2, which is what is on your screen, tracks the language of the 15th Amendment. This is a complex legal analysis about whether a particular map might violate the Voting Rights Act. So we put on there, you should consult your legal counsel. When you are about to approve a map for your jurisdiction, this should be looked at. I will say that the laws and the cases in this area are complex. They are often 100-page opinions that go back in history to look at the voting in particular jurisdictions. And they are based on historical patterns of voting based on race and color and what happens with the map that you are currently approving. So the other thing to keep in mind is that evidence of intent can be relevant. In other words, did you intend to discriminate against a certain color or race? However, intent isn't necessary to prove a violation of the Voting Rights Act. So it can be relevant, but it's not necessary. So this is why it's a little difficult to put your finger on it all the time, because it would be easier, right, if this was intent-based. If you could say this person intended to do this and you could show it, but that's not always the case. Next slide. So again, under the Voting Rights Act, redistricting has been used at times to prevent minority voters from gaining political power by drawing districts in a way that resulted in those voters having less of a chance of electing their candidates. This is known as minority vote dilution, and it is commonly occurs in two ways, either packing or cracking, which are interesting words, and we're going to go over those briefly. First, next slide, packing occurs when minority voters are compressed into a small number of districts, when they could effectively control more of that district or more of multiple districts. So an example of this is when map makers draw one district that is 90% a single minority group, when they could draw two districts with more than 50%, which would give minority voters the opportunity to have two elected officials potentially in two different districts. So the first, that 60-40 split is probably fine. The second one, as you can see, your minority voters, which is in blue, are packed into 3 districts and don't get to impact the other 2 where that's possible. And so that's likely illegal packing. And the final fake little map there in blue shows a potential proportional outcome in a 3-district situation. Next slide. So voter dilution can also show up in what's known as cracking, which is spreading minority voters thinly into many districts. In other words, they're split and fractured, so they don't even have sort of any equity in any of the districts. So this would occur, for example, if there are 3 districts and they have 40% of a single minority population in each. The first one, probably the 60-40 split, is probably an equitable distribution. The second little map there showing the minority groups spread equally into the three, but not enough to impact any of the three in terms of their vote power. So that's probably cracking them into 3 districts instead of maybe allowing 1 or 2 of these districts to have the majority of the minority voters. And the proportional outcome is shown in the final map. And so it is possible. And look, again, as I said, some of this voter dilution doesn't happen with intent, but it happens because you might be drawing maps. For example, in the County of Orange, we have software. You may have a substantially equal population, but you may have split a minority group inadvertently without knowing it. And so that's why something called communities of interest is important. And that's something that we will be addressing. Mark is going to pick up from there.
And so, again, one of the biggest changes between, you have all the pandemic, the census data, but EB 849 makes substantial changes to the procedures and criteria that govern city and county redistricting. As mentioned before, the code allowed the board to consider, or city council in its discretion, to consider in no particular order the following factors: topography, geography, cohesiveness, contiguity, integrity, and compactness of territory, and communities of interest of the division. And there was no statutory explanation as to what those terms meant. So back in 2011, and what Orange County did, and I think a lot of other jurisdictions would do, is that they would adopt a policy that would sort of, provide some more additional criteria or standards for applying these, discretionary factors. AB 849 changes that. So not only do they change and change the procedures that we covered previously, but they also create substantive criteria in an order of priority. So, first, of course, before you can get to the criteria, as Nicole mentioned, it has to be substantially equal. You have to comply with the Voting Rights Act. Then you get to the 5 criteria. Number 1, it has to be geographically contiguous. 2, you have to maintain geographic integrity of neighborhoods or local communities of interest. So they have to share common social or economic interests. And 3, and this one only applies to the county, is that you have to respect the geographic integrity of cities or census designated areas to minimize division. And probably an example of a census designated area would be, like, for example, Watts. There's not a city of Watts, but there is a census designated area of Watts. You have to make district boundaries easily identifiable and understandable by residents. And then finally, the 5th one, and the 5th one down on the priority list, is that supervisorial districts shall be drawn to encourage geographical compactness. Now, to kind of explain by what we mean by the order of priority is that even though you might want to have a pretty map that is really compact, if it violates the criteria above, then the compactness and the kind of the elegance of the map has to yield to the criteria that is higher on the priority list. So maybe an example might be, you might have a really thin looking map, and the reason why is because it is, it follows down a coast, or you have a valley area that's long, and the reason why is because it's not really accessible from the sides. So, those are, so AB 849 provides some specific mandatory criteria that agencies have to apply. Just to go briefly on these factors, contiguity, of course, to extent practical, districts have to be geographically contiguous. Basically, they have to touch, and by touch, you can't just have like a point. This has, it's not sufficient. They have to actually be attached. Here's it's probably a picture's worth 1,000 words. This is what we mean by contiguous. Earlier, you saw the redistricting map of Garden Grove. Not to pick on it, but just you can see just because of how the jurisdictional boundaries of the city itself is, you have like this really thin line, and that one is it is contiguous, and and it's connected, I think, by a city. So we could kind of scroll back later on, but. And next I'll go to communities of interest, which Nicole will be handling.
I need to unmute myself. Sorry about that. Thank you, Mark. So as we briefly mentioned earlier, communities of interest is a good place to focus to avoid the pitfalls of creating maps that violate the Voting Rights Act or AB 849. Again, under AB 849, we should maintain the geographic integrity of any local neighborhood or local community of interest to minimize the division. Well, what is a community of interest? A community of interest is more than just a city or perhaps even a housing area, a particular housing area, a particular development. It is represented by those people that share a common social or economic interest, and that should be included in a single district for purposes of effective and fair representation. Examples of COI, or communities of interest, include culture, areas in which the people share similar living standards, use the same transportation facilities, have similar work opportunities, or access to the same media. People can belong to multiple communities of interest. Importantly, and under state law, communities of interest cannot include relationships with political parties, incumbents, or political candidates. Communities of interest can be described by creating maps and telling us, so even before we have the census data, this is a critical place where people can comment, telling us about their community of interest. This can be done through oral testimony, written testimony about describing your story and telling your community's story. This can be done again by creating a boundary map eventually, or the entire community can be involved in the redistricting process. And again, focusing on communities of interest is a good way to avoid some of the pitfalls that we talked about with legal violations concerning race and color. Next slide. So I'm sure this is, there you go, Mark, thank you. I'm sure this is a term that everyone has heard, which is the gerrymander. And I had Mark add this salamander into the slide because this was actually an attempt by someone to create districts that were in the shape of a salamander. And this was done for the purpose of basically favoring a political party initially, when the gerrymander was first an issue. However, under AB 849, which is state law, the board, a city council, a special district cannot adopt district boundaries for the purpose of favoring or discriminating against a political party. So in California, we are trying to tame the gerrymander. Gerrymandering in more recent times has also been used to enforce and to essentially, as a violation of the Voting Rights Act, right? To put particular racial or ethnic minorities in certain districts. And that is a violation of the 14th Amendment, because under the 14th Amendment, race cannot be the predominant criteria in drawing districts to the subordination of other issues. But again, in California, you can't adopt district boundaries to favor or discriminate against a political party, or for that matter, on the basis of race or color. Next slide. However, despite California's attempt to prohibit adopting districts for the purpose of favoring or discriminating against a political party, the same is not true for federal redistricting. So the United States Supreme Court has recently held in the Rousseau versus Common Cause case that there are instances where partisan gerrymandering claims present political questions beyond the reach of the federal courts. What this means is that we have districts that look like what we're showing on screen. They're not salamanders, but they're very interesting shaped, bizarrely shaped electoral districts. And the Supreme Court, again, in some cases has said that, hey, there are certain times when political considerations can be taken into account when drawing the districts. And again, this requires a substantial amount of evidence and historical evidence about whether or not this is occurring and whether or not this is a political question versus a question that a court can adjudicate. Because courts, as a general matter, don't interfere with the policy determinations of a board, or in this case, the legislature, the United States legislature. And so while again, in California, this gerrymandering, we're trying to tame it. Elsewhere in congressional districts, it is possible that it would appear and be legal. I will say that looks matter. So in my humble opinion, under state law, most of these little maps violate contiguity and the principles of AB 849. So drawing maps that look like these 5 on your screen are likely not going to pass muster under state law. Next slide. So we've covered a lot today, and as Mark said, some of these topics could be their own topics, but you can find out more on the state redistricting website. The county has a redistricting website, and I am sure our local cities and school districts and special districts have their own websites. We did not collect all of those here, but these are good places to start, and we have information on there. And I think Mark, next slide, is going to sort of cover where those might be.
Oh, and these are just some additional sites for, we have, as Nicole mentioned in the prior slide, state redistricting. One thing I want to mention is the We Draw the Lines website. That covers congressional, state Senate, and state assembly districts. But in addition to being able to directly participate in that process, it also has a lot of helpful information generally about redistricting. So you may want to visit that as well to get an overview of this redistricting. For city, communities, college, and school districts, I would encourage you to visit the local agency websites for more information. And then finally, there's many advocacy and community-based organizations that actively participate in redistricting. This list is not comprehensive, but this is a list of folks who submitted comments and were active back in 2011, the American Civil Liberties Union, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Common Cause, League of Women Voters of California, MALDEF are examples of groups that have participated in redistricting and presumably will be participating in this go around. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I will yield it to Rebecca Lee for questions or to give us questions.
Thank you, Nicole and Mark. Fantastic presentation with a lot of very useful information for, I'm sure, many of us who may be new to this, or even if they had experience, realize that there are several changes since 2011. So I will be accepting questions in the chat. Thank you to those who have already been communicating with us. I will say that our single most frequently asked question is, will these slides be available to you? The answer is yes. We will be receiving these slides as a slide deck in PDF format, and they will be uploaded to our website at ocvote.com/academy. It's the same website used to accept the registrations for this session. So we will be uploading our slides there. And we are accepting other questions. That's actually the only question I've received so far. I did receive a question for the link to the Orange County Redistricting website, and I will be providing that in the chat. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to add it on. We'll get started on our next session at 11 a.m.
And Mark put the county redistricting website is up on the screen now.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, so we did receive a question. The question is, has the county already started the community interest meetings?
Yes, so our first public hearing was in June. We are having another public hearing to accept information or comments on communities of interest or really anything about redistricting on July 27th. And then we have a series of public workshops scheduled for August. And those public workshops, and I just want to get my dates right, are August 3rd in the 5th District at Mission Viejo City Council Chambers, August 4th at the 1st District at Freedom Hall at Miles Square Park, August 5th at the District 3 City of Orange Council Chambers, and then August 11th in District 4 at the Fullerton Community Center Grand Hall, and District 2 on August 12th at Coast Community College. All of those, again, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 11th, and 12th of August will be at 6 p.m. at the locations indicated. And if you visit the county's website, you will be able to view those dates.
And we encourage, from the county's perspective, we encourage people to attend. And this is a great opportunity to provide some direct feedback. And you kind of making even though the delay in the census data is problematic, the bright side is that it allows people to really focus in on those kind of non-demographic data, because sometimes people just jump into the demographic data and make some assumptions as to what binds the community. And this is a great way to talk about to provide some evidence, testimony about what binds particular communities. And it's not always just by demographics. I mean, you think of you might have some community organizations that might be based upon a policy, whatever. And so these are great opportunities to participate and to have an impact even in advance of receiving the data.
And also we have on the website, which is up on the screen, there is an online submission form, and you can submit comments via a phone line and via an email address that you can find on our redistricting website. And those comments can be about communities of interest or whatever you want. And we started accepting comments weeks ago. And we will continue to accept them, and they will be forwarded to the board at whatever their next meeting is. They will receive all of the comments we have received to date.
Yes, and I also provided the link in the chat for the county redistricting website, and all the dates that Nicole had mentioned, they can be found on that website as well. So please feel free to visit and provide your feedback. We received another question for Mark or Nicole. The question is, just to confirm, for special districts and water districts, we just need one public hearing. Also, can you confirm the deadline for redistricting is April 17th, and the deadline to submit maps to the ROV is July 6th?
I'll go and get that one. Yes, the election code, in fact, I'll tell you just the election code that governs special is going to be found in election code 22000, and the specific election code on a hearing is election code 22001. Now there's a caveat, and of course I'm a lawyer, I have to go throw in a caveat. These are the general rules that apply to special districts. However, Depending on the special district, and there's different types of special districts in the kind of organic statute for that special district, you might have a more specific requirement. So that's why we also encourage you to consult the specific district that you're interested in to see what their website is. For example, water districts, that those provisions are governed in the water code. So, while these are general rules, you should you should check the specific district to see if there's any special rules that apply to that particular agency.
Yes, and to add on to that, and following up on the second part of that question, confirming the deadlines for redistricting. Yes, so for those special districts, April 17th would be that I believe it's 204 days before the election in November.
180.
Oh,
for
180
special districts.
for special districts.
And that's going to be on slide 11.
Yes.
When you get your slide deck, all of this information for special districts.
Yes. Right. And also to add on to that, I wanted to actually mention that in my presentation, I will be actually addressing the deadline to submit maps to the Registrar of Voters office. And it's actually, although the deadline is legally on E- 125 days before the election, the Registrar of Voters asks that the maps are submitted as soon as they are adopted, because there is an extensive process that takes place once the maps are actually received. I believe our operations manager, Justin Berardino, will also provide a comment if he has anything else to add. Justin, do you have anything else?
Well, Rebecca, you mentioned what I was going to add is that although that there's that deadline, if you're adopting, whenever you adopt the maps, that means you have a map. So just send it to us as soon as it's adopted.
Exactly. All right. So I think that's all the questions we received. I know, Nicole, you did mention that you had another meeting to attend to. So if you do need to step out, we completely understand. And Mark, if you are available to stick around until the end, we may receive some additional questions that maybe you'll be the best suited for. So with that, thank you both so much for leading this first session of our Redistricting Academy. And we'll go ahead and begin our next session. All right, so thank you everyone again for attending now the second part of our first session of our Redistricting Academy. And if in the first part of our session, we focused on the requirements of how to draw those lines. In part two, we'll explain how the Registrar of Voters uses those lines and GIS technology to develop the ballots that go out to our 1.8 million Orange County voters, and why planning ahead is so critical for this process. So first, let's see. There we go. First, on the slide, you'll be able to see that there are several stages in redistricting. One aspect of redistricting is the process of actually drawing the lines, which Nicole and Mark have covered. And oftentimes, this is probably the phase of redistricting that receives some of the most attention. However, beyond what is involved in the actual line drawing process, there are also several requirements regarding what the Registrar of Voters will do in order to actually produce the ballots for our voters. The next stage of redistricting, again, is not often the center stage, but it is in fact the phase in which the local elections official administers this data of the new district boundaries at the hyperlocal level and to the voters. Our office at this phase will be creating and modifying any precinct boundaries based on the new map boundaries that were submitted by the counties, by the cities, and special districts, among others. And this will allow us to, in this phase, we'll use these maps to eventually create the ballot types that go to our voters. Simply put, this list on the screen describes the different phases that we will take, or the different steps involved in this phase. So step 1, the completed maps are submitted to the Registrar of Voters office. Once the maps are submitted, we then have to verify those maps to make sure that they can be added into our software, and then we'll take our GIS technology or geographic information systems to make sure that these maps are accurate. We'll then create, modify, proof the precincts that will be used in Orange County, and eventually create the ballot types for the election. As was asked in the question previously, the lines should be shared with the ROV as soon as they are adopted. And this is referring to those lines for the maps. We want to make sure that once the lines have been adopted, you have a completed map, and that map should be submitted to our office so that we can begin the next steps. The timely submission of the new district lines is critical because there are a lot of other components that are involved in the redistricting process, which I will go over in the next slides. As you know, the state and county are already engaged in redistricting, and the links to the Redistricting Academy, the redistricting websites can be found in the chat. However, the city, school, and special districts have a little bit more time before redistricting for them actually begins. However, they are encouraged to actually begin the redistricting process as soon as possible because they have that time to start working with communities if they need to, and working on those maps to get them to our office. Learning what's on the ballot will really help you understand who is responsible for submitting which types of maps. On our website, you'll be able to see the contests that will be on the maps in the June 2022 primary election. The website will be updated again for the general election in November as well. In June, we have the need for the supervisorial district lines, and that will be submitted by the County of Orange. And we are also waiting for maps from the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, which will include the lines for the Congressional, State Senate, State Assembly, and State Board of Equalization. Boundaries for the statewide primary election include, again, the supervisorial district, the Congressional, State Senate, and State Assembly districts. And the Board of Equalization and judicial districts actually contain the entire county, and those will all be received at a later time. Again, like I mentioned, city, schools, and special district contests are not on the June 22 ballot. However, preparing for the census data that is set to arrive and preparing for redistricting should begin now. All right, so as I mentioned, step 1 is really the important phase of getting the maps to our office in a timely manner. Step 2, when we're actually working with our GIS team here at the Registrar of Voters, we'll be working to actually figure out the addresses, figure out the lines, and really using the technical resources we have to make sure that we're creating the right ballots. So GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, are used to improve election operations and election management. Some of the benefits of using GIS in elections include the enhanced speed, accuracy, and efficiency, reduced risk of any errors, improved control of the data, and also increased access to information. By increased access to information, one example could be the tool that we have available online for all voters. If you visit ocvote.com/maps, you could enter your address in Orange County and actually see who your elected officials are. Now, putting GIS into perspective, we've created this diagram to kind of let you see how we go from maps to actually creating the ballots for voters. So here is the first layer that you can see. If you were to pull up an image on your phone or on your computer of just Orange County, we've zoomed in here on Costa Mesa and the Newport Beach area. You can see that this is just a general aerial photo of that area. That will be the first layer. And then on top of that, we'll then layer on the street parcel information and exactly identifying where those addresses are located. Once we have that layer in, we then want to look at the city boundaries, any special boundaries, the congressional boundaries, all of those maps that are actually being created right now in the redistricting process will be laid on top. Again, an example of here's some lines showing the special districts. Again, laying those on top of the previous maps. And then eventually we'll be able to get our precincts. So the precincts take into consideration of all the lines drawn before it and also additional requirements, which will be covered in the coming slides. Once the precinct map is created, we then have a ballot map, which shows which ballots are issued to which voters. And those are the GIS layers that we create and manage here and eventually use to bring the election to the voters. One thing to note is this is a skill, geocoding, we use in our office to make sure that addresses are being properly plotted on the map and voters can be identified at their address. It's a fantastic GIS skill and it really allows us to pinpoint every location and every address with precision and accuracy. Geocoding began in 2016 and that's where you can actually see the green dots. And it expanded dramatically in 2018, noted by the red dots. And all of those dots, if we look a little closer, are actual points for houses in the county. Now, once we have all the addresses plotted, we've received the maps, we can then go into the precinct modification phase. So first, what is a precinct? A precinct or a voting district is the smallest unit into which electoral districts are divided. And precincts are important for providing the ballots to the voters and reporting results on election night. Precincts, like redistricting, have rules and legal requirements. And in California Elections Code 11222, there is actual details for how the precinct should be created. No precinct shall be established so that its boundary crosses the boundary of any supervisorial district, congressional districts, congressional, senatorial, or assembly district, board of equalization district, judicial district, incorporated city, ward, or city council district. This is to say that when we layer those different maps on top of each other, we're not cutting through the different districts that have been submitted in the maps to our office. We're taking into consideration all of those lines and using those lines to guide how we create the precincts and modify the precincts if they've existed before and now need to be updated. So a precinct is determined by two criteria. One, by the intersection of all the unique jurisdictions in a given area. And two, there is also a requirement that there is a maximum of 1,000 polling place voters or voters who are non-permanent vote by mail voters. And there cannot be more than 1,000 per precinct. So while the map itself may not have a line dividing two different areas, if there are more than 1,000 voters in a given area, then our office would need to create more precincts to make sure that we do not have more than 1,000 in a given area. The graphic that you see on the right that is being animated, it actually shows how we're layering the different lines that we receive in order to create the precincts. So the first line you'll see is the congressional lines. Again, this is for the maps previously. Of course, we are expecting these to change in the 2021 redistricting cycle. But we layer on the congressional lines, the senatorial lines, the assembly lines, the supervisorial, city, and city wards if a city has wards. And then finally, the most densely populated one with the blue lines is the precinct map. Just to pull an example of what precinct modification may look like. So for example, we may have school districts that we need to incorporate into a precinct map. So the image on the left with the green lines, you can see 4 different precincts, and perhaps these precincts were created using the different maps that were submitted, whether that be the congressional lines, the requirements for precincts to only have up to 1,000 non-permanent vote-by-mail voters, or other criteria. In this example, the Fullerton Joint Union High School District and the Fullerton School District, so FJU, HSD, and FSD, submitted maps to us, for example, of the different trustee areas. So first, when we look at the requirements for the Joint Unified High School District, we see that on the top section, we need to take into the consideration of the new line that is formed by this, the special or the school district here. So everyone living above Commonwealth would be voting for the trustee in Area 4, whereas everyone below Commonwealth would be voting for the trustee in Area 3. Now, we also need to consider that there is the school district in trustee Area 4 and FSD. So there is another section that is partitioned out for the upper half, and then again for the lower half in trustee Area 5. So while in the previous map we had 4 precincts, you can see that with the inclusion of the 4 different trustee areas just in this small square, we've now expanded from 4 to now 8 different precincts. Another requirement of these precincts is that they must be frozen prior to the election. This means that the precinct boundaries must be fixed so that there's no more change beginning on the 88th day prior to the election. So for the June 7th, 2022 statewide primary election, this means that our precincts must be fixed by March 11th. And these fixed precincts are then used to determine the ballot types for our voters. So here is now our final step when we're actually creating the ballot types. Here you can see the different colors are actually depicting all the different ballot types that were created in November 22 for the presidential general election. In that election, the Registrar of Voters actually had 406 different ballot types across the county. And this map is representative of that. Though the colors may seem similar, it's hard to find 406 different shades of colors, but every color is different, and there are 406 unique shades in this map. And it shows all the different maps that were created for the election. And if you look here, this is actually just focusing in on the Costa Mesa area. In Costa Mesa alone, we actually had 55 different ballot types in the November election. So if you recall in that previous slide where I talked about the precinct modification that may occur due to a school district providing lines to us, here you can see how the precinct would now, you may have had just one ballot type for this precinct prior to us receiving the school districts. However, now with the 2 different types of school districts, you see that we will actually have 3 different ballot types in this small square. So the first ballot type would be the Unified High School District Trustee Area 4 and the Fullerton School District Trustee Area 4. And that is the precinct 13084 and 13069. So these 2 areas would have the same ballot type, assuming all things remain the same. Another ballot type that would be created for this area would be those below Commonwealth or in Trustee Area 3 for the Joint Union High School District, and also part of still the Trustee Area 4 of the Fullerton School District. So these 2 precincts here would then have the same ballot type. And finally, the third ballot type that we can see just from this map is below that line in Trustee Area 5, and also below the line of trustee area 3, these 4 precincts down here would have the same ballot type. So again, this is just an example of how we go from precincts to actually creating the ballot types for the voters. Now, as we discussed, the delays in census data has ripple-down effects affecting everyone in different capacities. Of course, the counties and cities have the struggles of being able to draft those lines and have them approved by the set deadlines. However, the condensed deadline, of course, is a struggle for the cities, the counties, and the state. But there's also a condensed timeline now for the Registrar of Voters office. As we mentioned previously, although the legal deadline is E-125, the Registrar of Voter has a need to receive those maps as soon as they are adopted by the jurisdiction. And that there's also another thing to note in that there are deadline differences between the county and legislative offices. For the June primary, we know that the county will be finishing up their maps on December 15th. However, the date in which the legislative offices or the California Citizens Redistricting Commission will actually finish their maps has not been formally decided. Right now, we are looking at a mid-January for when we will receive the maps from them. And so again, those differences in deadlines may create other issues as well. And of course, we also have the candidate nomination period, which will be beginning for the June primary. It would begin in February. So if you look at the dates that we're juggling, we're receiving maps in mid-December, possibly again in mid-January, but candidate filing would then begin in February. And so our office will be working very hard to make sure that we take into consideration all the lines that have been drawn and using those lines to guide how the precincts will be created and modified for the June primary election. And that's why it's critical, even though we have the delays with the census data, it's critical that your offices, or if you're involved in the process, to make sure that those maps are submitted to our office here, the Registrar of Voters, so that we can make sure that the ballots and precincts are being created correctly. Here, just to note some of the key dates that are coming up. June 7th, 2022 is election day for the statewide primary election. E-25 is February 2nd, 2022. Again, while this is the last possible day for jurisdictional boundary changes, we want to emphasize that this should not be the last day that you are, this is only the last day you should submit, but it should not be the only day you should submit your maps. You should be submitting your maps on the designated deadline mentioned in the previous presentation of when you should complete your maps by. Again, once your maps are adopted, make sure to get those maps to our office as soon as possible. E-13 is February 14th, 2022, and this is when the candidate nomination period begins. And as you know, the candidates must be running for office and they must live in the district that they are running for office. And so we want to make sure that the candidates understand that they do qualify for the office that they are running for based on their address. And we need those maps to be able to tell the candidate whether they qualify or not. E-88 is March 11th, 2022. This is a key date for multiple reasons, but it is when the nomination period ends for candidates, and it's also when the boundaries must be fixed with each precinct not exceeding 1,000 voters. And lastly here, just to document it on a timeline, we're looking on the far left of today. We're working towards that first big milestone of E-174 or December 15th, which is the redistricting deadline for the county offices. So this is the day that the county must finish its maps for the supervisorial districts of Orange County. On the top, we then move to E-173, which is December 16th, which is actually when the signatures in lieu period begins for the candidates. E minus an undetermined date at this point, but we are looking at January 2022 for the redistricting deadline for legislative offices. And this is when we expect, again, the California Citizens Redistricting Commission to finish up their maps and get the Congressional, State Senate, State Assembly, and Board of Equalization lines to our office. E minus 125, again, it's a deadline to submit those changes. Again, once those maps are completed, make sure to get them to our office so that we can begin working on the process for redistricting as soon as possible. E minus 88, March 11th is when precincts will be fixed, and it's the end of our candidate filing period. And then eventually working towards the June 7th, 2022 primary election. I don't have a timeline for the November 2022 election. However, I do know that those dates will be slightly different. If you would like, we will again be posting these slides on our website, and you'll be able to see those specific deadlines as was presented by Mark and Nicole in the previous presentation. And on those slides, you'll be able to know exactly when you are expected to finish your redistricting process, and then of course submit those maps to our office so that they can be considered. All right, and we will open it up to questions. I wanted to leave enough time for those joining us today to ask how this process may be clarified, and just so that we can help you and make sure that you understand what to do in preparation for the redistricting process and getting those maps over to our office. All right, so we'll go ahead and take a look at the questions. And we'll also be having our operations manager, Justin Berardino, joining us to answer any of the questions we may receive. All right. So, the first question was actually a clarifying point on the timeline slide, in which the date said December 2022. It should have been corrected to December 2021. Thank you for catching that. That is a correction that will be made before we upload it onto our website. And another question we received is in regards to the recording of the sessions. Yes, the session is being recorded and will be available on our redistricting website for the Orange County Registrar of Voters office on the Technical Redistricting Academy. Again, that website is ocvote.com/academy, and it will be provided in the chat. Once the map is adopted, Justin, maybe you can answer this one. Who specifically should it be sent to?
Who should the district boundaries be sent to?
Yes.
Is the question. So once they're adopted, I think that most of you normally have contact through our Marcia Nielsen in our Candidate and Voter Services Department. She has reached out to the city, special districts, school districts in the past to receive boundaries. So that would be the best person. Otherwise, if you don't know who that is or don't have the contact number, you just call our office and we'll get you all set up.
Thank you. Another question, maybe Justin, you can answer this one. Are the elections for Orange County Board of Education and the County Superintendent of Schools on the ballot for June 2022?
Can you repeat that, Rebecca?
Yes. Are the elections for the Orange County Board of Education and County Superintendent of Schools on the ballot for June 2022?
I believe the Board of Education will have some up that I'll have to double check that. I don't have that in front of me.
All right.
And then the other one was County Superintendent of Schools.
Yes.
Yeah, that one should be up also on the 22 ballot.
Yes. The slide that I had in my presentation didn't have every contest listed, but on our website, you will be able to see what's on the ballot for the 2022 election as well. All right. All right. And another question here is the ROV still using polling places or vote centers? The Orange County Registrar of Voters is using the VCA, or the Voters Choice Act. So we are a vote center county, and we will be operating vote centers for all of our elections. All right, and thank you, Mark. He kindly provided the link to what's on the ballot for our 2022 primary election, and you can click that link to learn more about what will be on the ballot in our elections in June next year. That looks like all the questions we've received so far. We will be keeping the chat open for the next maybe 10 to 15 minutes. So I will be here to stick around to see if there are any additional questions that you may have regarding the registering process. But thank you all for joining us today for our first session of our Technical Redistricting Academy. And I hope that the session was informative to you. And again, as a reminder, the session has been recorded and it will be made available on our website and along with the slides. So thank you again for joining us this morning, and we hope you have a great day. All right, so it looks like we are not receiving any additional questions. So we will be closing the session at this time. Again, you're welcome to join us again next week for session 2, data and resources. And our slides and recording will be available on ocvote.com/academy. Thank you.